Hi folks, you're with Tassus today, your pushback channel. Going off a little bit off political topic to some extent anyway. In this video I'd like to talk about, or in this essay I'd like to talk about the Zulu and British battle in South Africa in, when was it, 1879 at Isandlwana, which was followed shortly by a second battle at Rorke's Drift, one that was made famous by the movie called Zulu, that I think was made in the early 1960s, and it's still not a bad movie today. Actually, if you have a look at it, I think you can find it online or pick it up in secondhand video shops, that sort of stuff. So the situation at the time in South Africa was that the Zulu nation had pretty much conquered all the other black African tribes around the area, that part of to the north of what today is the northern part of South Africa, or north east. And so they were a huge and very militaristic, very expansionist kingdom, a black African kingdom. They weren't high tech at all. They were still really sort of not much out of the Stone Age in a lot of ways, but they had a very disciplined warrior caste, and given the population, quite a large army. And again, they'd subdued all the other black tribes and nations in that region. And they were expanding south at the same time as the British were expanding north. So it was a matter of time before they clashed militarily. It was kind of a foregone conclusion, really. There's an attempt these days to make out that it was evil white supremacists and poor little black people being oppressed. That's bullshit. Bullshit. The Zulus were possibly the most warlike people on the African continent. In fact, they were. Well, possibly were. They were. So anyway, they were inevitably going to clash with the British. They'd had conflict before with the Dutch sort of based Boers in South Africa. So there'd been previous conflict there. Now the British had sent an army up with cannons and guns and modern sort of technology of the day. So they thought they would win pretty easily in any pitched battle, and probably would have if they brought their numbers to bear. But the Zulus had between 25 and 30,000 warriors or soldiers, and these guys knew how to use the land and how to move around. They're very fit. They could run many miles and still be in good enough condition to fight a battle. So this was something that the British could never do, or a very small number perhaps, the commandos, that sort of thing. But the battle at Isandlwana was an interesting one. I want to talk about the things like the rate of fire from the rifles, but also, if you like, the force to space ratio. So firepower confined or brought into a certain space and concentrated is far more deadly than firepower, the same rate of firepower dispersed over a wider area or across a wider sort of front area or across a wider sort of frontage of meters or yards. So I want to talk a little bit about that and its role that it played in this Isandlwana battle, and how it could have been a little bit different had the British been a little bit more switched on. But anyway, so let's look at this. A column of British soldiers commanded by Colonel Pauline, who actually was not an experienced combat officer. He had around a little bit over 600 trained British regulars there. And he had another 600 of hangers-on, cooks, people to look after the horses, folks to run the wagon trains, native levies to do tracking, all that. So they had about 600 more hangers-on. So say around 1,200 people. They were joined by a small cavalry detachment later, and that made the total complement. Now, the Zulus had around a ballpark 20,000. Now, there's some debate over whether there was 18 or 23,000 Zulu warriors that came after this British column under Colonel Pauline. But it's generally accepted that however many there may have been in the area, that only about 15 or 16,000 actually engaged the British column. So we've got a situation here where the Zulus, if there's 15,000 of them charging at once, can they charge down a position that, and this is pre-machine gun days, can they charge down a position where there's only about 600 experienced soldiers there, maybe 650 if you want to be generous, but about 600, and they've got single shot rifles. This is the days before the repeaters and the breech loaders. Now, what the British were doing was they were sacrificing frequency of fire for long range. So these Martini Henry, as they were, the Martini Henry rifles, they had around between 1,500 and 1,800 yards distance. They really weren't very accurate beyond, say, 400 to 500 yards, but still pretty good. But once you get repeating rifles that have a rapid rate of fire, the accuracy drops off to not even 100 yards. 50 yards, most of it. So the British wanted long-range accuracy and long-range firepower, and they were prepared to sacrifice the repeating rifle or the rate of fire for that. Now, they compensated for the lack of rate of fire because you had to load one bullet at a time. It's a single-shot thing. They had compensated the rate of fire by having concentrated fire. So you put a lot of single-shot rifles together. Now, an experienced rifleman or infantryman in the British Army could do as much as, say, 12 shots a minute. So say ballpark 5 seconds. Now, that 5 seconds, by the time you discharge the spent cartridge, put in the next cartridge, lock the breech again, ready to fire, you really don't have much time to pick a target. So the assumption is you're just going to fire into massed ranks of the enemy that are charging at you. So if you look at the, say 500 yards accurate, and with killing power, really not much longer than that in reality, then you're looking at say 500 yards, and how many fit Zulus could cover that easily in say 2 minutes, less than 2 minutes, say a minute 30. Now, in that time, an experienced soldier would have got off, say, 18 shots, but without aiming. So if the ranks of the Zulus weren't massed, then a lot of these bullets would miss, or a percentage of them would miss. And just to give you an idea, at Rorke's Drift, a later battle, the British expended just on 20,000 cartridges, and for kills or injured Zulus at about 1,500. So that gives you an idea that the success rate or the hit rate is, and this has included Zulus who died from injuries later on, by the way, and some of these injuries were made by bayonet. But let's be generous and say that somewhere between 6 and 7% of the bullets found their mark. So that's the hit rate that you can expect in real battle conditions, where you're desperately loading quickly. The guys with spears are screaming at you, running at you. You're not really. Very few people. Only the most experienced soldiers would have to calmly reload. Find the target, aim, and make sure they had an aim and shoot. You can't get off 12 shots a minute if you're doing that sort of thing. You'd be lucky to get off 4 or 5 shots a minute. So in reality, the high rate of fire only works if you've got mass troops giving volley fire in 2 rows. That's the kneeling row and the standing row. So they tended to often have the shorter guys kneeling and the taller guys standing, so they could go out. Now then you've got quite a concentrated rate of fire, and that's what the British were doing. So it's one-shot rifles, concentrated troops giving 2 ranks, or sometimes even 3 ranks of volley fire. So that was the way they were doing the trade-offs. Now, in Isandlwana, where the British, by the way, were massacred almost to, well, not to the man, but close to it. And bear in mind, there's only about 600 or so experienced soldiers. There are other people that can carry a rifle, but some of them never shot a rifle before, and you know were incorrectly placing the bullets in the breech. They were locking in the breech, and that would screw the rifle. So they weren't much use at the end of the day. Try as they may have. So the British troops were spread out over a length between sort of 12 to 1500 meters. So there's only one soldier per 2.5 meters across that length. Now some had heavier concentrations of experienced soldiers than others. So some had gaps where the firing rate would have been much lower. But given that if you look at, and we'll just pick 600, and let's be generous and say they were going to get off 10 shots a minute, which I doubt, given they were being charged at. But so that means they were shooting 6,000 bullets a minute across that 12 to 1500 meter frontage. And let's be generous and say it was 1200 meters. It was a bit longer. I mean, some say it was 1350, but it's kind of academic to make the point that I'm about to. So let's assume 1200 meters and assume that the killing range was maybe a maximum of 450 meters. Now in that 450 meters approaching the British lines, there are various gullies, small gullies and sort of depressions in the earth where if the Zulus took a couple of good volleys and hits, they dive into these gullies, so they couldn't be shot at. They then move and crawl along till they were ready to make another mass charge, and up they'd get, and so on. So they could get actually quite close to the British lines, 150 meters. So then it's maybe, for these fit warriors, it's 15 seconds from the time they jump up out of these gullies until they're actually engaging directly in hand-to-hand combat. Now, in those 15 seconds, even the experienced British troops are going to get off maybe, two bullets, 3 at the outside. So when you spread across that sort of meterage, that frontage, given the 1200 meters, the concentration of fire is actually quite low. So the force you can apply in terms of the amount of fire and the rapidity of that fire over that width is quite light. Now, even so, it was still enough, that firing was still enough to hold the Zulus back. They were still going to ground, and they were taking quite decent casualties. So they were balking at charging the lines. Now their captains and generals and whatever were encouraging them, saying, come on, let's go. Is there only another 100 meters? Let's go get them. And the Zulus were aware that once they got in close enough, that the technology of the British, their rifles, would become meaningless, and it would be hand-to-hand combat with shields and spears. And the Zulus were more experienced and fitter and stronger than the most of the British would have been. So at that close engagement level, the Zulus knew they could stand a much better chance. But just looking at this, the mathematics of force to space. There's really, once you do the mathematics on this, the British were doing 5 shots per minute per meter of width of frontage, and that was just enough to hold the Zulus back. But then what happened was the quartermasters weren't releasing bullets, fresh ammunition quick enough, and they weren't because of the length of the quartermasters with the ammunition dump were at one end. So the soldiers at the further end were having to run 500, 600, 700, 800, 1,000 meters to go and get fresh ammunition, and then run back to so the distribution of ammunition was piss poor, and how the officers didn't do a much better job of that's quite beyond me. It seems such a basic thing. If you can't get ammunition to your troops, they can't shoot. If they can't shoot, they're going to get overwhelmed, and the whole position will be overrun, which indeed it was by the Zulus. So as soon as that rate of 5 shots per minute per meter which again was just enough to hold the Zulus back. As soon as that rate dropped, because of the maldistribution of ammunition, that's when the Zulus successfully charged down the position. And once part of the position was overrun, the position two with the most experienced soldiers in it, once that was overrun, then it was really all over. It was game over for the British at that point. Now, I guess there's a couple of other things worth commenting on. When a battle occurred, when the British set up their tents and all that sort of stuff, when they struck camp, or when they set up camp. Now, when a battle started, the policy manual, if you like, of the army was that you had to pull the tents down because you didn't want the enemy sort of coming in and hiding behind the tents or getting in them or something. So they put the tents down. That was sort of 101 policy procedure there. Now, Colonel Pauline sent a message to the general in charge, Chelmsford, and said, "I've got a battle here. I need some help." Only at the last minute did they realise that they were facing up to almost 20,000 Zulus. Now, it doesn't matter how good you are. If you've only got 600 experienced riflemen there, infantrymen there, and you got 20,000 dudes trying to kill you, you got a problem, no matter how good your technology is. Particularly, we're talking 1879 here, remember, and single-shot rifles. So he sent a message to Chelmsford, which arrived in time. They could have responded, and a disaster could have been averted. But the general was of the view that the major Zulu army couldn't be in that location. So the British reconnaissance was piss weak. Well, certainly nowhere near as good as it should have been. The fact that the Zulus could run 20,000 people across those sort of distances without anyone noticing is incredible. A credit to their ability to use the land and the gullies and the crevices and the canyons. Credit to them. But it regardless of the credit to them, it was a piss weak effort by the British reconnaissance there, that they didn't even have some inkling of that until the very last minute. Now, Chelmsford sent some of his junior officers up to the hill and said, "Look," because they could see it through the telescope, see the battle site from or part of it from the telescope. Now, because of the way the wind was blowing and the sort of acoustic shadow, they couldn't really hear as much noise as would have been suggested by a battle. So they kind of didn't respond to that. But when the guy looked through the telescope, the tents were all still set up. For some reason, Colonel Pauline hadn't ordered the tents to be pulled down, so that when they looked, they said, "Well, no, the tents are still up. The battle manual says you have to pull the tents down. The tents are not pulled down, therefore there is no battle. Or the battle is of such minor consequence that they don't need to pull down the tents, which means they're handling the battle fine themselves, and they won't have a problem dealing with whatever's going on there." So there's a lot of hesitation and balking. Should we go? Should we not go? Then there was a second messenger came from Colonel Pauline saying, "Hey, we're in serious trouble here. We need help." And again, they went to look up whether the tents had been pulled down, and they hadn't. So they assumed, well, it can't be that bad. Maybe this guy's panicking too early because he hasn't had much battle experience previously. So there was all sorts of little ones. Some reinforcements were sent, but then another officer came along and said, "No, they don't need reinforcements. Go over there. Don't go this way." So through miscommunication, ineptitude, maldistribution of ammunition, little things, but enough of those things lined up, enough errors and mistakes and oversights and shortcomings lined up, so that nobody went to help these beleaguered British troops in Isandlwana, and as you would expect, given the massive weight against them, they were overrun and killed, and only a small number managed to escape. And in fact, if you didn't have a fit, well-watered, well-fed horse, you weren't going nowhere. And most of these people were killed, and even the ones trying to get away. So that's an interesting sort of battle in South Africa at the time, and one that's seen as a great Zulu victory. I don't sort of see it that way. I think 20,000 guys, of course they can overrun 600 trained soldiers, but had the there's a couple of things could happen if the troops had come in, the British troops had come into around 500 meters width, maybe a little bit less, between 400 and 500 meters width. If they'd come in that close, they could have done concentrated firing. They could have delivered ammunition much more easily, much more quickly to the people at the far end of the line. And I think that rate of fire would have been enough, because then you'd have one person, per a little bit less than a meter, 1.15 people per meter, and they could soldiers per meter, and they could have maintained a very solid rate of fire, and they'd have been. The Zulus wouldn't have got as close, which meant the soldiers wouldn't have panicked as much and just been firing blindly and desperately, and so they would have been a higher rate of accuracy. Because they'd have been concentrated in like that, the Zulus in turn would have had to concentrate, because there's so many of them. They in turn would have had to concentrate and charge down in massed ranks, and they would have in turn suffered more casualties. So I think Isandlwana was eminently winnable, or if the Zulus had still prevailed, that the casualties would have been enormous. I mean, as it turns out, they killed, again, apart from the irregulars and the cooks and the horse people looking after the horses, they only killed just over 600 British soldiers, but they lost over 2,500 soldiers themselves, with many more dying from injuries in the following days. So then at Rorke's Drift, so the Zulus lost between 4,000 and 5,000 men for really demolishing 600 British soldiers. So it was hugely costly. And but that disaster for the British, at least at Isandlwana, I believe, could have been averted, and that's this force to space ratio. The force was distributed over too wide an area, which then diminished its capacity to deliver, in this case, deadly rifle fire at a sufficient volume. You've been a Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.